Menuge is also here, professor of philosophy at Concordia University, Wisconsin, president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society. His research interests include philosophy of the mind, philosophy of science, apologetics, and C.S. Lewis. He earned his PhD, and if you have one, you know you earned it, in philosophy from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and a diploma in Christian apologetics from the International Academy of Apologetics, which you will hear more of today. Also, he's the author of Agents Under Fire, Materialism, and the Rationality of Science. Would you help me welcome Dr. Angus Menuge? And then we have Dr. Paul Copan, who we have put through the work this week. He is recently back from Lubbock Christian University, where we have a partnership and share our resources there. And he was there this week to do a lecture and to invest in the young students and faculty there as well. He's a Christian theologian, analytic philosopher, apologist, and author. Currently professor at Palm Beach Atlantic University, fellow Floridians. And he holds the endowed Pledger Family Chair of Philosophy and Ethics. He's the author or co-author of 16 books, including Did God Really Command Genocide? Coming to Terms with the Justice of God. And Is God a Moral Monster? Making Sense of the Old Testament God. I bet we can dig into that a little bit this afternoon, because that sounds fascinating. Would you help me welcome Dr. Paul Copan? And finally, our distinguished guest for the weekend, Dr. John Warwick Montgomery, or as we've become accustomed to referring to him as JWM around here. In his presence, we'll call him Dr. Montgomery, an ordained Lutheran minister, theologian, professor, public debater, and the author of more than 50 books. He's also an accomplished lawyer in the United States, a barrister in the UK, and an advocate of the court in France, which is typically written in French, which I don't speak, so we'll just go with advocate of the court. Specializing in religious freedom cases and international human rights law. When you combine those two fields of study, you get an outstanding Christian apologist with particular interest and expertise in historical, legal, and evidential apologetics. He's the director of the International Academy of Apologetics, which we've mentioned, Evangelism and Human Rights, which is based in Strasbourg, France. Dr. Montgomery holds 11 earned degrees in law, philosophy, theology, even librarianship. Interesting, he's here with us this week. From Cornell, University of California, Berkeley, Wittenberg University, LaSalle University, University of Essex, University of Chicago, University of Strasbourg, and Cardiff University. And this is an interesting person a little bit. Dr. Montgomery will celebrate his 90th birthday on Monday, just in a few days. Thank you. Thank you. He is married to Carol, who is somewhere here with us today. There she is. And the two of them have traveled all the way from France to be with us this week. Would you again help me welcome both of the Montgomerys? We're glad you're here. Really, really glad you're here. For today, some of you are familiar with our format and what we do here at the Lanier Library. I have to first say, at least at this stage, stop and say, the one person who's not here who is most upset about it is Mark Lanier himself. Now, we do have Becky, I see, sitting here. We're glad that Becky's been able to join us. But Mark's trying a very, very important case in Cleveland, Ohio, and will not be released from that duty until 5 p.m. today, Cleveland. And he'll make his way back. He'll be with us tomorrow for the afternoon and evening, so we hope you'll come back to the lecture. But I'm sure he would want me to say how much he regrets not being able to be with us today. But duty does call, and we're glad he's doing good work there. For us, we're going to talk about styles of apologetics today and the need to offer compelling arguments for the faith in contemporary culture. We have 4 outstanding apologists and authors, theologians, scholars, speakers, and we're going to ask them some questions today and try to get a conversation going around the subject of apologetics. But I thought it might be helpful for us today to begin with sort of an introduction panel, because we want to make sure we're all on the same page, maybe to define terms or have an operational definition, because some of us have been exposed to apologetics over the years. Some of us, this may be a new topic or a new field of conversation. So let's start with some basic questions. We call these the softball tosses. So I'm going to throw you a couple of easy ones, and this one is the easiest of all. What is apologetics? Dr. Ordway, you're closest, so let's have you take a shot first. Just define for us, what is apologetics?
Well, I would say, primarily it's the defense of the faith. It's the response to St. Peter saying, be ready to give a response when people ask for the reason for the hope that is within you. So it's a response to challenges. It's a response to questions. It's being able to give a reasoned account of why we believe what we believe. And in my own work, I find it helpful to make a distinction between apologetics and evangelism or evangelization. And I would view apologetics as the removal of obstacles and evangelism as the proclaiming of the gospel. And I think that the two are obviously very closely tied together, but it helps to distinguish a little bit because the tasks are not identical, but they need to be wedded together and both help each other.
Good. So I love that, and I want to pass that then to Dr. Menuge because I want you to, if you will, to talk to us more specifically about Christian apologetics and what that goal might be and how what Dr. Ordway just says, in fact, does require the coming together of those two ideas. Talk to us about that.
If it's Christian apologetics, then its goal should be evangelism. And so it should be a defend of the gospel. It should be centered on Christ. Now, we will have to begin the apologetic wherever anybody asks. The unbeliever or the Christian with questions is the one who sets the agenda. So if they want to talk about the explanation of the universe, we may have to begin there, but it better not be the case that we end there, because if we do, and we establish the existence of God, but they do not see that Christ is Lord, that Jesus is God, then we have failed to do Christian apologetics. Christian apologetics must make the case for Christ. It must get them to the foot of the cross. Otherwise, we're doing apologetics in the sense of defense, but we're not doing Christian apologetics.
So the goal of apologetics is not to win an argument. It's to win a hearing for the gospel in the hopes of winning a convert or a new follower of Christ. We want to get to the gospel is what you're saying. And Dr. Ordway focused on removing barriers to the gospel and then the sharing of the gospel to bring someone along. Dr. Copan, are there different approaches to apologetics, different styles, different schools of thought? Talk to us a little bit about how varied this field really is.
There are different approaches for sure, and I would say that there are some that will even involve a pastoral element. I define apologetics as the art and science of defending the Christian faith. And so there is the personal, relational character issue, but also the kind of objective dimension too of evidences and arguments. And there are people who take differing views on this. There are some who are evidentialists, who would take the evidence as being the basis for arguing for Christianity, for the gospel. And Dr. Montgomery has done that very effectively, and he has taken that approach that Angus was just maintaining, that to simply go to show God's existence is inadequate. You want to point them toward the gospel, toward Christ, and it being a means to evangelism. So that's sometimes called the one-step process. There are others who take the two-step process where they seek to establish the existence of God, someone like William Lane Craig, arguments for God's existence, but also pointing to evidences for, say, the resurrection. There are others who take a viewpoint in apologetics, might be called and that would be, I guess, Bill Craig's approach would be considered the classical understanding of apologetics. And then there would be others who might take a reformed understanding, the reformed epistemological approach, where you are basically saying that I'm rationally justified in holding to the Christian faith. And that the Christian faith is not based on argument, and Bill Craig would argue that too, but it is not so much focused on on evidences per se, because one could be justified in believing in God as properly basic, for example. So there are different approaches. I could go into others. There are the presuppositionalist approach, where you assume that the Bible is the Word of God, and you argue from that assumption. So it's not taken as not that you could get away from neutrality, but you begin with the Word of God as your kind of starting point, and basically try to show that any other viewpoint that does not take the same sort of view of human nature and human sin and so forth seriously, then it will be inadequate. So it's kind of like a worldview approach although they do tend to downplay arguments for God's existence, they see that as somehow, I don't know, it sounds like works righteousness or something, or that grace is somehow avoided. But I would disagree with that sort of an approach. But basically, that's the general range of views there.
Very good.
Well,
Yeah, please.
Well, I would actually add one more, which is what I do.
Cultural.
So the imaginative approach, and this is something that we can call leading with beauty, because when we talk about God, He is perfect goodness, perfect truth, and also perfect beauty. And in our modern culture, a lot of people are really skeptical about the moral argument because of relativism, and we have to deal with that with rational arguments. But first, we have to get a hearing. People are often skeptical about claims of truth, again, because of relativism, and we need to address that with rational arguments, but first we need to get a hearing. And you can see where I'm going with this. Beauty is subversive. I mean, look at this beautiful chapel that we're in. This chapel itself speaks to us of the Christian faith. It gives us an image of heaven. It is moving even to someone who is not currently a believer. And I'm a convert. I was an atheist, so I speak in part from my own experiences. So leading with beauty is using beauty, whether it's the beauty of witness, whether it's the beauty of art and architecture, or in my specialty, the beauty of literature, to get an opening, get a possibility of talking about this, because to experience beauty is to experience the transcendence of God, and that's accessible to everybody. The same way the natural law is accessible to everybody, but people don't always want to talk about the natural law. So then if we lead with the imaginative approach, if we get people interested, if we get people, say, talking about the Lord of the Rings, which a lot of people who are not believers are interested in, then we can start talking about things like goodness and truth, and how is it that we have these convictions? And then we can start leading into some of these questions. So I think the imaginative approach, I want to put that out there as another approach, but not one that is contrary to or in competition with evidential, philosophical, moral approaches, but rather complementary to it.
Yeah, no, good point. And one of the things that I have found, if I can just add to that, there's kind of I found that in doing apologetics, there's very much of a pastoral element of people, especially when we're grappling with the problem of evil. C.S. Lewis talked about the emotional and the philosophical problems of evil, that often this difficult case for Christians and for all worldviews actually, is, it's just an opportunity to hear people's stories. I just found that put the arguments aside and just engage and listen to people's stories, finding out where they're coming from. And sometimes you find out that the problem of evil is not the real issue. Other times, there may be some other issues behind it, and so you want to look for what the questions are behind the questions.
Very good. Thank you. I'd love to come back to a comment you made about Bill Craig toward the end on the ultimate apologetic, as he refers to it. So if I forget, remind us to come back to that. Dr. Montgomery, you've built a wonderful career of great impact for the sake of the kingdom in the field of apologetics. Help us understand why it would be important for every Christian, any Christian, a follower of Christ, to be exposed to, at least, but rather versed in apologetics. What does it mean for them as an individual Christian person to be familiar with apologetics?
In California, when I lived in California, I found that there were not a few evangelicals who moved into cults by way of megachurches. And the basic reason for this was that they never considered the truth question relating to Christianity. So many evangelicals, they were drawn to the church by subjective considerations. They felt better, they were happier, they had more fellowship by going to the church and so forth. And of course, the difficulty in that context is that pagans can provide a very attractive atmosphere too. Our Mormon friends have succeeded very well in bringing people into the Mormon situation because they are so nice. They're really nice. And I'm not against niceness, but it seems to me that we need to distinguish very carefully between the idea that you choose a religion or you choose a worldview because it makes you feel good and because it's a nicer situation for your family. Or on the other hand, you choose it because, as a matter of fact, it's true. And sad to say, our culture does not help people to face truth questions. One of the most serious difficulties in the modern world is that religions are not regarded as making truth claims. They are regarded as sociological entities that will give you certain kinds of experience. And so people take the approach that they will choose the religious context or the non-religious context depending upon their own psychological or sociological situation, their needs in that sense. It seems to me that it behooves us not to confuse truth questions with experience questions. It isn't an issue of what kind of experience we want to get people into. It's a question of whether or not, since eternity is a lot longer than the length of time we're spending here, the real question is, what is the way by which we can get ourselves attuned to the source of the universe as truth, particularly in light of the fact that if you take diverse religious views and diverse philosophical systems, they all mutually contradict each other. Therefore, there is no chance in the world that they can all be true. And so it seems to me that the Christian apologetic ought to try to get people in a loving and sweet manner to recognize that quest for truth is paramount, and that they therefore owe it to themselves to make sure that they are not worshiping the great pumpkin. All of these religious views are potential belief systems. There's no doubt about that. But the issue is, does any of them have a basis for the convictions that they set forth? And I believe that if we can help people to see that only the revelation of God in Jesus Christ, as exemplified in the Holy Scriptures, only there do we have that kind of solidity so that we can be confident in our religious position that it really does reflect the real nature of things. Most of us in bringing up children want to help them to distinguish between their likes and dislikes on the one hand and reality as they're going to confront it. I think that you could define the purpose of apologetics as bringing people to religious maturity so that they can finally see the difference between a mythology that has no foundations and a factual truth that can save.
Great. So, there's a lot of subjectivity these days and relativity, and even Christians are not immune from saying, well, I believe it because I believe it. In other words, belief is the foundation of their belief, or feeling is the foundation, or preference even is their foundation. We've all heard somebody say at one time or another, I just can't believe in a God who, which is a pretty flimsy basis for believing, because I'm essentially the basis in what I believe. But beneath the belief, there's the foundation of truth. So instead of the question, what do you believe, we should ask what is true, and then base our beliefs on that truth. So you've helped us as you've articulated that. Dr. Copan, how do we expose ourselves to and become more acquainted with apologetics for the sake of other Christians? Because Dr. Montgomery has said, if we aren't careful, we'll all become Mormons because they're nice. And they are. But what about for the sake of other Christians that we might shepherd or mentor or challenge along the way?
Yeah, Dallas Willard has said that apologetics is basically an exercise in doubt removal to move people toward the truth in order to move them, whether a believer or unbeliever, toward the path or on the path of discipleship. And so there are different pathways that are available for Christians to deal with doubts in their own lives. One Catholic theologian, Avery Dulles, said that there is an infidel within each one of us, and that there are. And how many times have I spoken to youth groups, or I teach in a university, and people who are carrying around doubts with them, but have no opportunity to express them. St. Augustine had this experience earlier on in the 4th century, growing up and being told to just be quiet and believe, and not really have a basis or grounding for why he ought to believe. And so in my own experience, I want those within the church, young people within the church in particular, but in general, all of them, to have a comfort level with being able to address questions and doubts that they have. One of the things that I've done within my church and in other forums is it's a dealing with doubt forum. I speak on a topic, and then for about 20, 25 minutes, and then for about an hour, just fielding questions that people have, giving them that comfort level where they can address, where their questions can be addressed without any prohibition. They can just raise whatever. We did this around our kitchen table with our children. I have 6 kids. And so we would just say, they went to public school, and so lots of questions would be raised, and we would say, well, what sorts of questions have come up? What sorts of things are you guys talking about? What sorts of issues or challenges you have about God, the Bible, etc.? And so we spent an hour after dinner talking about these sorts of things, wanting to make sure that our kids felt the comfort level that the Christian faith could address those truth issues. So it does begin within our own churches where we model that. I think somebody like Tim Keller has been an excellent model for giving apologetical angles in his sermons. And so we need to create that kind of a culture within our own churches, within our own homes, etc. But that's a starting point.
So that raises a great point. Let's take some time, and we will in just a little while, to maybe hear some of the frequently asked questions and what some of you all might respond by way of answer to these more popular questions about our faith or in opposition to. Before we get there, though, let's stay on the same conversation, but now shift to the non-believer and the non-follower of Christ. And it's too simple to say there are 2 groups, but there are at least 2. One group who is open to the gospel, and then there are another group who is disinterested in the gospel, not looking, not seeking, if we can use that term. Let's take those 2. And Dr. Menuge, would you speak to the apologetic for the non-believer, but who is open to the gospel?
Yeah, if they're open to the gospel, if they are open to the idea of the supernatural, what they need to understand is what's going to count as good news. And what makes it good news is that it has to be the plan of salvation that comes from God, not from man. What we're seeing, and this relates to what Dr. Montgomery said, we're seeing still moralistic therapeutic deism, which is the idea that you have a religion which functions to meet your own therapeutic needs. If they're open to the gospel, they really need to see that the gospel is good news for them. Christ is a physician only for the sick. And I think that still a very powerful apologetic that will help them to see that Christ died for them, and is for them is found in the works of authors like Pascal. Because Pascal shows that man is wretched, that he has a hole in him that is essentially infinite. It is the gap between what he should be and what he is. And you see then your need for God to complete you, and then Christ is the one who actually bridges the gap. All the other world's religions, in one way or another, claim that man can bridge the gap between himself and God. And of course, it's an impossibility. The finite cannot reach the infinite. The imperfect cannot reach the perfect. And so it must happen the other way around. And so if they're open, but they're not sure the gospel is for me, I say that kind of apologetic, where you see Christ is my physician. He's somebody I need to heal me, to complete me, to make me whole, is a powerful way to go.
So I'm open to the gospel, but I'm also open to a number of other world religions, different philosophies. You're helping me to see why I've got to choose. And the question, again, Dr. Montgomery raised of truth is they can't all be true because they're not in agreement. So clearly we've got to choose. I'm not a follower of Christ, and I'm trying to decide which of the 2. You're presenting me with the claims of Christ, which by nature are not going to permit us to embrace plus. We have to choose Christ, or our choice is to deny
Right,
Christ.
that we need to confront them with unique claims of Christ.
The unique
that
claims.
His way of solving the problem of the gap between God and man is a completely unique way, and that really sweeps the board of the other world religions and shows them why they need Christ.
Good. And Dr. Ordway, I'm not a follower of Christ, and I don't want to be. I'm not mad about it. I just have zero interest in it. I'm busy. I'm successful. How are you ever going to get me to sit down over a cup of coffee and listen to the gospel?
Well, this is the challenge of the 21st century, because you've just described by far the major audience that we have for apologetics. It is by far the biggest audience, and it's also the most difficult to reach. And so I think this distinction between, forming Christians, reaching the ones who are open, and then the ones who just are not interested is a really, really essential distinction. And what I would say is that someone who is not interested in hearing the gospel, it doesn't matter how good an argument you put before them, because we have marvelous arguments. We have, all these, for instance, Dr. Montgomery is a premier example, all this wonderful evidential argument. But unless and until the person finds the question meaningful, they're not going to be even interested in their sources. And until they find the question meaningful, they're not going to be motivated to listen to it. Because, honestly, there are so many things that we could hear arguments for. You could be an argument for, joining CrossFit or becoming a vegan or going into space exploration or becoming a Marxist or, becoming a libertarian or, all of these things. We're bombarded with arguments for all sorts of viewpoints. But we always have to decide, do I want to listen to this argument? Is this something that is meaningful to me? And I think one of the biggest challenge that we face is that for a huge swath of our audience, questions about God, about God in general, not even getting into specifically the Christian gospel, it's not that they disagree, it's that they find the very question to be meaningless and uninteresting. And so it does not do any good to say, here are these 5 brilliant arguments for the existence of God, because they're just going to say, so what? Give me 5 arguments for the existence of leprechauns, like whatever. It's not going to connect. And so a lot of what my work has been in apologetics has been on the question of meaning. Because, for instance, even take a word like God, which you would think would be reasonably uncontested. 50 years ago, it was reasonably uncontested. So 50 years ago, you could have a conversation with an unbeliever like Bertrand Russell or George Bernard Shaw, and at least they were rejecting the same God that we believe in. That's not the case anymore. So today, if you say, "Oh, well, you should believe in God. Do you believe in God?" The answer they give, no, I don't believe in God. But it's like, which God do you not believe in? Because if you don't believe in the giant spaghetti monster, well, neither do I. Let's get that off the table. I don't believe in an old man in the sky who's going to throw a thunderbolt at me if I say a bad word. Well, good, because that's a stupid idea. I don't believe in it either. Christians don't believe in that God. But trying to get to the heart of, well, do you believe in the ground of all being? Well, what's that? I guarantee you that most people who say, I don't believe in God, have not really come to grips with what we mean by God. And this comes back to something that Dr. Copan was saying about the need to educate believers, because unfortunately a lot of believers talk about God as if he was just a particularly strong guy. And they talk about God in terms that fit into the faulty categories that skeptics already have, and it makes it easy for them to reject it, and it makes it easy for Christians to lose their faith. If God is the nice grandfather in the sky who answers prayers, what do I do when I pray for a beloved family member to be healed of cancer and that family member dies? A lot of people walk away from the faith because they have a faulty understanding of what the word God means. God is not an ATM machine for prayer. So I think this question of meaning is so fundamental. I think it underlies all of what we're doing. It underlies making it possible to have conversations that involve philosophical arguments and that involve evidential arguments. Because only when somebody is more or less on the same page as to the idea of God, oh, so what you mean by God is a transcendent being, like being itself? Now I'm interested in hearing your arguments as to whether that might actually be the case. Oh, so you're saying that Jesus really existed and he's not just an idea. Well, maybe I want to hear a bit more about who he was and what he did, and then we can advance into evidential apologetics, for instance, and making a case for the gospel, because people at that point are at least more or less using the same terms that we are and meaning the same things, even though they don't yet agree with us. At least they are using the same meaning for the terms. And this is the really crucial point, they care about the answers. And that is particularly where literature and the arts help. Imaginative apologetics, literature and the arts will not actually make a case for the gospel, and not in itself, but it makes a case for the gospel being worth listening to. And I think that's where we need to build that up so people actually care about the questions that are being asked and answered by evidential and philosophical apologetics. And then maybe they can actually attend to those truths that are being offered to them.
Great. So we're convinced. We're laymen in the local church. We teach Sunday school. We serve on a committee, sing in the choir. Some of us preach sermons. Some of us do different work in the kingdom. So we want to grow in the area of apologetics. Just to whomever wants to shout out an answer, where do we turn to? What books do we read? What videos do we watch? How do we improve or grow in the area of apologetics? Tell us.
Well, I would start out just by saying that often you'll find that you don't get the resources in your home church. It's a rather sad fact, but that many pastors don't have training in apologetics, and I do recommend events like the International Academy of Apologetics or any other good, solid apologetics meetings and gatherings, and you run into people. We also have one at our National Evangelical Philosophical Society conference. Together with that, there is an apologetics conference. But that's the kind of place where you actually run into people who enthusiastically focus on the defense of the faith, and they have the books and resources. They introduce you to the leading scholars. Sadly, that one often does not find that in one's own church.
And I would.
Yes, please.
Sorry, I would say this is what I do. I work for Word on Fire Catholic Ministries, and that ministry does a lot of video resources in particular, loads of just free programming on YouTube, on our website, where it's providing videos and materials for Christians to use to educate themselves. And it's a Catholic ministry, but it's broadly evangelical, and I have found many people of my students and colleagues who are Protestants, who are evangelicals, who are Orthodox, who find these to be useful resources. So that's something that my ministry is attempting to do, the ministry that I'm part of, and of course the Word on Fire Institute is designed specifically for the equipping of Christian leaders, providing formation and training and equipping specifically for ministry leaders, for people who want to be evangelizing and to be apologists. But I would just put that out there as an immediate free resource. Word on Fire, this is what we do, because there is such a need for that, and it really isn't often served by the local church.
One other possibility, Dr. Copan?
Yeah. I would certainly want to tap into those resources too, and just to reiterate what Angus said, the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and both of us have been presidents of that society. We do that apologetics conference that is so important, that is, this time we're meeting actually in Fort Worth, an apologetics conference in Denton in November, and so it'll be the week before November, before Thanksgiving, of the Thursday night, Friday night, Saturday morning, where a number of us will be presenting, and a lot of people who are just lay people want to come. There'll be resources there. A kind of an entry point into this also would be the Apologetic Study Bible, which introduces you to a whole host of themes, often in bite-sized chunks, but yet you're being referred to scholars who have written in this simple form, but yet giving you an idea of whom you can follow up on and look up their resources. I teach at Palm Beach Atlantic University. We have a Master of Arts in Philosophy of Religion. Paul Gould, who teaches in the area of cultural apologetics, so what Holly is emphasizing and doing a great job in. We're also seeking to do at PBA, and also Brandon Rickpaw, who from Baylor is now teaching with us. We have a robust program. We're emphasizing public philosophy as well, where we're trying to train people to engage the public sector. And so that might be a place for people to come and look at getting further training. So those are one final place I would point people. And it's like your one-stop shopping, if you want to, at whatever level, would be William Lane Craig's reasonablefaith.org website, where he has videos, kind of introductory videos on God's existence, the resurrection of Jesus, and so forth. Debates between Bill Craig and atheists or Muslim scholars, articles on the Christian faith, interviews, podcasts, etc. So excellent resource there. So that's where I typically point people if they want to just get exposed to it, kind of look around, surf around, and that would be I think kind of a final emphasis there. That's just a terrific stopping point.
Very good.
Starting
Okay.
point.
And in my humble opinion, one of the most important things in choosing materials is to make sure that they do not use technical, theological, or philosophical language. One of the reasons why C.S. Lewis has had such an effect apologetically is that he writes as an educated layman, using the language of the educated person who is not trained in philosophy or in theology. Our evangelical apologists invariably employ philosophical and theological terminology which is perfectly natural to them and which is incomprehensible to the non-Christian. And it seems to me that when you're choosing materials, for goodness sake, almost the first question to ask after you've asked the question, is this person solid theologically and is not presenting some kind of heresy, is the question, is the language going to make sense to the non-Christian? A good test is to see if a high school student can at least get the general idea from what is being presented. Now that sounds simplistic, but I think one of our biggest problems is that apologetics works within evangelical Christianity have read like works of systematic theology or dogmatics. And of course, sorry to say this, but the Catholics are far worse, especially the Thomists. They have an imaginary audience of people exactly like themselves. And what you've got to do, if you're writing in this field, is to make sure that your imaginary audience consists of educated laymen who are not already committed to what you believe. And I think only if that fundamental principle is maintained are you going to get anybody to read anything, right? With all due respect to Bill Craig, who took his first apologetics course under me, with all due respect to Bill Craig, a lot of his writing is utterly incomprehensible to the non-Christian. It's very comprehensible to philosophers who are raising the same questions that he's interested in. But 99% of those questions are never the questions that the non-Christian is really asking. This has always reminded me, and I once made him quite irritated by citing the example. It is said that someone went to St. Augustine and said, "What was God doing before he created the world?" And the response of Augustine was, he was creating hell for people who ask questions like that. And if the questions we're trying to answer are not meaningful questions, to use your terminology, if they are not meaningful questions, or if they're incomprehensible questions, or if they're questions that are not answered in Holy Writ, and therefore nobody is going to find an answer to them, if they are technical nonsense, to use the epistemological phrase, if they are technical nonsense, for heaven's sake, what are we defending? All right.
All right.
If I may jump in briefly, Bill Craig has written books for children.
Yep.
He's also written simplified versions of his more technical work, and he engages in podcasts and discussions where he actually has the question of the day from people who are writing him from all over the world. So he writes at a scholarly level for sure, and he's also trying to address the academy, that's a legitimate area of engagement and debate. And because he's done that, I've met a lot of people who, in the academy, have come to faith in Jesus Christ because they've been persuaded and have engaged with what Bill Craig has been doing. So there's a place for both. I mean, I try to straddle both, the scholarly, and also write books like True for You but Not for Me, or That's Just Your Interpretation, or How do you know you're not wrong, or When God Goes to Starbucks. So, and dealing with common questions that people are asking. So it's important that we do communicate on that level, but there's also a place where we engage with some of those tough ideas and also have a credibility with those in the academy. Someone like Alvin Plantinga, who's won the Christian philosopher, who's won great respect with many people. So I want to add that I think there is another dimension there that can also be considered. But you're right about what C.S. Lewis has been highly successful because he's been able to communicate at a lay level in a way that is winsome and connect with his audience.
And by the way, he was continually criticized by the professional theologians and professional apologists because he didn't seem to be a member of the club. All right, maybe you want to ask the question, do I want to be a member of the club?
Good question.
Okay, but I am, of course, not running down Craig's work. I'm simply saying that he is an example of a danger which we should be very careful to avoid, along with realizing the value of what he's done.
And I'll chime in to kind of like to connect those 2 points, since we're still, on the broader topic of how do we support people who want to learn this work. I think this highlights the importance of communication skills. It's not just to be formed as an apologist and evangelist is not enough to have the sound theology and the right ideas. We need to actually be able to communicate them to our audience, whether it's an academic audience or a popular audience. And so I am going to do just a shameless plug for Houston Baptist University, the Master of Arts in Apologetics program that I'm visiting professor, as you noted, for that program. And indeed, I helped found the program. We have both a cultural and a philosophical track. And one of the things I'm most proud of many things I'm proud of, is that we really take C.S. Lewis as our model. We have a C.S. Lewis class taught by Dr. Michael Ward, pretty much the world's leading C.S. Lewis scholar. We have a mere Christian approach. And there's a big emphasis on learning how to communicate well. There's a writing course that is required for everybody. There's several optional writing courses, and there's a communication course taught by Mary Jo Sharp. So we really put a big emphasis on helping our graduates to become effective, not to know these things, but also be able to communicate them. And I think that's something I would add to, as you're looking for a place to grow, as an apologist, as an evangelist, find a place that can help you also learn how to communicate well what you know to your particular audience.
That's good. And thank you on 2 notes. One, thank you for defending Dr. Craig, by the way, who was not under attack, we understand. He'll be here February 17th. So thank you. Appreciate that. He'll be with us. You mentioned something, Dr. Montgomery, and C.S. Lewis. That gives us a chance to transition to sort of trends in the field of apologetics. It's been now just over 50 years since C.S. Lewis passed away. You have been a part of those 50 years in the sense of watching this field grow, change. Dr. Montgomery, how has the field of apologetics changed in the last 50 years? What shifts have you seen? What concerns you? What encourages you?
Well, this problem of subjectivity and experience being the focus, I think that has increased immeasurably in the last 50 years, so that so many American churches, especially American churches, but also churches in Europe have moved away from the truth question, as I said before. And I think that is absolutely deadly. If you do this, not only do you lose any possibility of presenting a meaningful gospel to the unbeliever, but you cut the ground out on which you're standing and open the door to all kinds of problems. I think that is certainly the case. Also, in the last 50 years, there has been a movement away from books to audio-viz and to podcasts and all this kind of thing. Now, of course, we need to use contemporary communication. Look at the value of the invention of printing for movable type just before the Reformation and the use of this by the reformers and their associates and so on. Of course, we need to use modern communications, but we have to recognize the limitations. For example, let's take podcasts. How do people listen to them? In many instances, they listen to them while they're driving home on a freeway. All right? Now, assuming that they don't have an accident, a serious accident, nonetheless, even if they don't have a serious accident, the fact of the matter is that the information is passing so fast that there isn't really any deep assimilation of anything. Right? The whole thing is necessarily on a very superficial level. Now, there are conscientious people, such as my dear wife, who listens to podcasts when she's sitting there at her desk, and she even takes notes and this kind of thing. But I firmly believe that the number of people like that is far less than the number of people who are taking a touch the hem of the garment approach to religion and to any evidences for it, and the retention level is virtually zero. If you want to learn something, there are two considerations, right? One is concentration, and the other is repetition. And neither concentration nor repetition characterize to any great extent the kind of electronic church and electronic apologetics that's going on at the present time. Now, I have a podcast series. Even I don't listen to it. So I'm simply suggesting what I'm saying is a bit of a warning, all right? Let's be careful. The medium can indeed be the message. And in some instances, you don't want the medium to be the message. What you want is Jesus Christ to be the message. And you want to shift the focus from superficial, clever podcasts to a clear presentation of the gospel. Which brings me to just one other little point. One of the biggest mistakes in apologetics is to start defending the faith before you've even made clear what the faith is. And we have seen that again and again and again. These evangelicals who go around thinking that if you can convince somebody that evolution is false, you have somehow brought them to the Christian faith. Nonsense. There are certainly a lot of people in hell who didn't believe in evolution. Okay? The salvation depends upon coming to a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Recognizing that you are a damn sinner and you deserve hell, and that as a result of what he has done for you graciously, you are able to escape that and have a meaningful life. And it seems to me that has got to be presented with absolute clarity so that at least the non-Christian knows what you're defending. And you're not doing this thing simply to convince people of true ideas. My apologetic is especially a legal-focused apologetic. It is said that lawyers fire rifles and laymen fire shotguns. That is to say, the lawyer lines up the ducks and he presents only relevant evidence that is relevant to the case. and to getting a verdict. I believe that apologetics needs to be like that. You need to realize that the purpose of this is the presentation of the salvatory work of Jesus Christ for that individual. It is not simply convincing them of various religious truths, no matter how true those truths happen to be. All right? And I think if we could maybe get our values straight a little bit in this whole area, we would do a lot better in our proclamation of the gospel and the defense of it.
Good. Thank you for that sermon. That was powerful. Great.
Bless you, brother.
Amen. Love it. Talk to us a little further about trends in apologetics. What do you see happening now in the field across the nation and around the world? Anyone?
I think what Holly is doing is illustrative of this, but I think we're seeing a more holistic understanding of apologetics. And there's, of course, rational argumentation and evidence, but also recognizing, and it kind of goes back to that apologetics being the art and science of defending the Christian faith, where we understand people, where we learn the skills of relating to them. Peter said to give a defense with gentleness and respect. And if hammering the truth down people's throats, or as I tell my students, beating people up for Jesus is your goal, it's going to be ineffective and counterproductive, and certainly not how Jesus wants us to approach others. And so the importance of relationship, building credibility, the importance of the imagination, where we engage people with another way of thinking, so that we can then give them another way of looking at things, so that they can actually exert their will to make a decision about what looks now a reasonable alternative. So there are also aspects of apologetics in which we engage in, of course, the arts, literature, where we engage in there's another aspect which deals with existential questions, the deepest human longings that we have, and again, going back to what Holly said, tapping into what is meaningful. People grapple with guilt, and so we can bring in the message of the gospel. How do you deal with the problem of guilt? How does an atheist come to terms with that moral gap that Angus was talking about between between the standard that we know and our actual performance and our failure? And how do we deal with that longing for immortality? How do we deal with that fear of death and so forth? And of course, all of these things tie in together. And it brings into focus the fact that human beings are God's image bearers. They're made in the image of God, and in all of the array of those considerations, emotions, will, imagination, intellect, etc. But yet using these aspects to build a bridge for the gospel, so that we can point them to the cross of Jesus Christ. Some people, I think of Louise Cowan, who taught at the University of Dallas, and she said that it wasn't any sort of reason she grew up in the Christian faith. Didn't have any. She saw the arguments, but it didn't connect with her. It was through literature, reading Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and others, where she said, this taps into my humanity. This connects with me at a deep level. And then she realized that it was actually the gospel that supported and sustained that was the truth behind those assertions that ground the very humanity that we all are familiar with and that those classics tap into. So I think a more full-orbed approach to apologetics, rather than here's an argument and that's wonderful, that's important, it needs to be grounded in truth, as Dr. Montgomery has said. But there are also different pathways and Jesus spoke to the Samaritan woman in a different way than he spoke to Nicodemus. And I think that relationality, that personhood affirmation, where we even listen to people's stories so that we can see, how does the gospel fit in here? Someone said, it was Pope Benedict, who said, when he was asked, how many ways are there to salvation? And of course, meaning Christ. He said, as many ways as there are people. That is, God has wired us differently. Different things connect with us. And so it's good for us to have those ears to tune into where people are coming from. So we can say, oh, you're an artist. You love literature. You love movies, etc. but ultimately grounded in the truth of the gospel. Of course, we don't want to get away from that. That needs to ground everything rather than the subjective approach that Dr. Montgomery has been speaking against.
There's an interesting distinction made by the early 20th century psychologist William James. It's the distinction between the tough-minded and the tender-minded. The tough-minded being the engineering personality, the lawyer, the person who is concerned with objective facts, and the tender-minded, the artist, the musician, the person who is more concerned with the inner life than the outer life. And we need to keep those foci in mind, because there are definitely people who fall more particularly on one side of this distinction than on the other, and vice versa. I did a book some years ago entitled Myth, Allegory, and Gospel, in which I focused on Lewis and Tolkien, of all people. And I did this to show that the kind of approach that they take can be used to reach people who are not interested in facts as such, but are really the tender-minded people. And since nobody is purely tender-minded or purely tough-minded, it's important to have both of those approaches in mind. The danger, of course, in the objective end of it is that one will forget some of the considerations that Paul has just pointed out. The danger with the tender-minded approach is that you lose yourself in subjectivity, and you won't recognize, as Tolkien did, that God has become the Lord of angels and of men and of elves, and these are means by which people can be taken to the objective truth of the gospel, as Tolkien and Lewis always did. So it seems to me that we need to keep those two foci in mind. And we ought to keep in mind at the same time the dangers of going overboard in either of those directions.
Very good. So we have about 15 minutes left, and I want us to take time now first to acknowledge that ideally we want people to think like an apologist and to have an apologetic framework, sort of a foundation and framework, not just rapid-fire answers to popular questions. That's a little less than we aspire to. Having said that, there are popular questions that we should reply to. So let's take a few minutes and let's pretend we're in an elevator. Everybody has an elevator testimony, right? That's the time it takes for you to see the doors close, go up 3, 4, 5 floors, the doors open, time's up, you're done. You have to share the gospel in that amount of time. So we're going to ask you some of life's toughest questions that apologists face all the time, and you have to give an elevator response. And only one of you need to answer each of the questions, and that way we'll get through quite a few of them. So it's going to be who's first on each question. And to tip you off, I've tipped them off on the questions, so they're ready. First question, elevator door closes, ding, press the button, 5th floor, is there a God?
I could take that. I would say, why is this universe here? It doesn't have to be here. We've got very strong reasons to believe that this universe is contingent. It exists. Why does it exist? Since it's all of nature, it must be grounded in something supernatural. Again, why are there moral obligations? Moral obligations cannot be grounded in anything that's just impersonal. Ultimately, you're obliged to a person. And if there is a moral law governing all of us, it will take you to a moral lawgiver.
Very good. 5th floor, ding, ding.
Well, and I want to jump in at the.
Close
I
doors.
want to come in at the 5th floor and go up to the 10th floor, if I
All
might,
right.
in this
Let's
building.
go.
Because I think that's a great answer. But I would actually approach it a little bit differently, because I love to ask the question back. Again, coming to the question of meaning. If someone says, "Is there a God?" I want to know what God do they want to know exists. So my response would be, if they say, does God exist? I say, well, what do you mean by God?
A higher being.
And then at that point, I might say, well, what do you mean by a higher being? Because, and if they say, and that, if you can help someone to articulate the answer themselves, it will have a much more profound impact than if they just receive passively an answer from you.
Good.
So if someone says, well, higher being, or goodness or something, well, what do you mean by that? And then probably at that point they might start to stammer or not really know what they're talking about, which is good, because it means if they have a pat atheist comeback, they have been disarmed from it, and we can actually talk about the question. Because if we give us a pat answer and they say, oh, well, that's stupid because, and they rattle off the latest, atheist YouTube, talking point. But if I say, well, okay, well, what do you mean by God? Like, again, the old man. Well, no, I don't believe in that, so whatever. So let's say we have a good faith conversation. Oh, a higher power. Well, higher in what way? Well, and at that point, I think it would be more powerful to say, give Angus's response, to say, well, why are we even here at all? What gives you the basis for saying higher versus lower? To kind of borrow some of C.S. Lewis's approach, because he has these vivid examples, as Dr. Montgomery has reminded us, these down-to-earth ones. If I punch you in the elevator for no reason, you're probably going to be a bit annoyed with me. Well, on what grounds?
Where's that come from?
Where's that coming from? And at that point, the elevator dings and we get off, and probably I have not gotten to the point of presenting the gospel, and I would be okay with that, because what I have done is unsettle them, and I have done some groundwork, and I have made them open to, oh, this idea of God is a little bit more complex, a little bit more compelling than I thought 30 seconds ago. So then the next time they get in an elevator and they hear it, they might say, well, who is Jesus? Because I think one of the problems with apologists is we're so eager that we can sometimes trip over our own feet. We're so eager to save their souls that we can turn them off by trying to give them everything at once. But as a teacher, I've been a teacher for 25 years. You cannot teach everybody everything at the same time. It's a simple psychological, emotional, mental fact of life. You simply can't do it. It won't happen. People won't take it in. So you take them as far as they can go at that moment. And then I think we have to prepare them, take them as far as we can go, leave them unsettled, leave them asking the question. Don't put them on the defensive. Leave it, I've ended many conversations with, for instance, hotel receptionists, oddly enough, saying, well, I'm just going to let you think about that. But no, just think about why do you think that anything is good? Okay, have a nice day. Because it disarms them, and then they do think about it. And then the next encounter, we can and should pray that the Holy Spirit will send the next person, because we're part of the communion of saints. It's not, thank you, Lord, not all on us. So let's pray then that the next elevator conversation picks up at the right point.
All right, speaking of next elevator conversation, that's good for you. I can appreciate that that's true for you, but that's not my truth. Dr. Copan, how would you handle that?
Of course, the question of truth, what do you mean by truth? Do you believe that it's true that Paris is the capital of France? Do you believe that it's true that what is on the prescription bottle is actually what the contents are within? And I'd say, I think the reason you probably believe that something is true for one person but not for another is you don't want to deal with authority. People are relativists, true for you but not for me, when it comes to God or ethics, right and wrong. They're very selective. And I'd say, are you a selective relativist? Or are you, or do you believe that relativism is absolutely true? And of course, what is truth? Well, truth is a matchup of a story or a correspondence of a story, a statement, etc., to reality. It's a matchup. It fits. So reality is the truth maker. If I'm saying something that is out of tune with reality, then I'm saying something that is false or incoherent. So I would want to ask the person about, well, does truth even matter? Does it, if you want to wish away something like AIDS in Africa or sexual trafficking, just say, well, that's just true for you. That's just your perspective. And you can solve all the world's problems just by saying, at least for yourself, and being uninvolved and detached, because well, that's just true for those other people. And actually, I would say the idea of relativism is really, intellectually problematic. It's intellectually escapist, because there are some really hard things that you have to deal with. There are decisions you have to make when you get on the traffic. Got to get on traffic. It's either that truck driver or me. You've got to make decisions. So you can't simply let truth be a matter of something that I decide what is the case. There's an objective reality. We find ourselves bumping up against that reality over and over again. So I want to challenge that person about the nature of truth and say, are you being selective, or are you an absolutist? Do you believe there is, if you say that there is no such thing as truth, you're basically saying that it's true, that there is no truth.
That's confusing. But true. Dr. Montgomery.
Yeah, that's quite right. And what you've been talking about is what is known technically as the correspondence definition of truth. Something is true if it corresponds to reality outside of the assertion itself. Today, you may or may not realize, there are many people, especially in the liberal theological community, who will not define truth that way. They define truth in terms of not correspondence, but relationships. And their argument is, didn't Jesus say, I am the truth, I am the way, the truth, and the life? So truth is really relationships. Well, on a higher level, of course, that's true. That's correct. Because it isn't enough just to maintain something that corresponds to reality if it has anything to do with personal life. In the case of personal life, the thing has got to be appropriated. And in classic Reformation theology, there were two words for a true relationship, and the highest one of these was fiducia, trust. All right. So truth wasn't just affirming something and joining the church; it was personally relating to it, which of course is absolutely vital in the case of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And it seems to me we ought to recognize that, though there is this higher level of personal relationship, that's the ideal. Nevertheless, that must be grounded in correspondence. For example, in the case of Jesus saying, I am the truth, if, as a matter of fact, the statement, Jesus was an historical person who came to earth, performed miracles, died on the cross, rose again from the dead, if that doesn't correspond to what really happened in history, then the last thing you would want to do is to create some kind of relationship with whatever that idea happened to be. So the first thing to do is to make sure that we are presenting Christian faith as corresponding to what has in fact occurred, the revelation as it has been given to us in history, for which there is solid and excellent historical evidence, and then not leaving it there. Not leaving it there. Once we are willing to say, yes, that's who he really was, and he really did that, and that sort of thing, then we ask ourselves, all right, if that's the case, what am I going to do about it? What am I going to do about it? Because he said, no man comes to the Father but by me. So it's going to be awfully important once you've gone along with the correspondence of historical affirmation with reality, with events, to enter into a relationship with him. Some people also call this existential truth. Okay, but the minute you mention that, then you get into Jean-Paul Sartre and Martin Heidegger, a fate worse than death. So you want to try to stay away don't call it that.
I've heard you all mention the Bible, you've quoted verses, you've told stories, you've used illustrations, but I don't believe the Bible. I really think it's myths, fairy tales, and fables, can't be relied on, therefore it is totally without authority. Who cares? Therefore, your entire argument collapses on itself because I don't accept your foundation. I don't believe the Bible. I don't mean me like me. Playing a role here, okay?
Well, I'll jump in with, I would take two different tracks in it. And again,
You
I
got
think
5 floors to get us there.
right, well, I would first decide which person I'm talking to, because with some people I would take one track and some people the other. Because on the one hand, I think that as apologists, we don't need to ground all of our arguments on the Bible. Because these things that God has done, as Dr. Montgomery has reminded us, happened in history. So even had there been no Bible written about them, it's still the case that these things happened in history and that Jesus rose from the dead and all of that. So, and the larger arguments about the existence of God, for instance, I could say, depending on the person, I might say, okay, well, let's not talk about the Bible just yet. Let's talk about how do we know that how do we get here? Why is there existence? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do you feel there is a moral sense? Because I think our discussion of the Bible, when we get to it, will be different if they accept that there is such a thing as God. That's one way I might approach it.
Okay.
But the other way I would approach it as a literary critic would be to say, hold on, when you say the Bible is such and such, the Bible is a bunch of different genres. And let's talk about how to read the different genres. Some of them are historical, some of them are poetic, some of them are historical, and which parts of it are you having an issue with? And then kind of talk about that, and then hopefully arrive at, well, you know, there are parts of the Bible that are poetry. The Psalms are expressing true things about God in poetic language. That's what poets do. It's still true. Just because it's using metaphor and image doesn't make it not true. It makes it truth or falsehood, whatever it is, expressed in metaphor and image. That's how poetry works, which, by the way, is why education in literature, the arts, and poetry will actually help us be better apologists. Side note. Anyway, so then I would say, but let's look at the Gospels. The Gospels as a genre are historical. They are not mythic. I am a literary critic. This is my area of specialty. They are not myths. C.S. Lewis made the same observation. They're not written in that mode. They're too close to the events to be legends. They might be true, they might be false, I would say to this person. But whatever they are historical documents. So we can talk about...
Much in the same way we have any history from that period of time.
Exactly. So I would delineate, I would say, let's not talk about the Bible. Let's talk about the part of the Bible that you're concerned about. Let's talk about its genre,
Great.
And then address the question from there.
Okay, let's do.
Okay.
All of that Old Testament killing and genocide and people groups, that part of the Bible troubles me. Can you, Dr. Copan, you've written on that. How do you help us with all of the tough stuff in the Old Testament?
Yeah. One mistake I think that we've got to avoid when people ask a question like that, one mistake is to try to defend the 66 books. For one thing, you're not going to live long enough to do this. If you attempt to deal with all of the potential problems that exist in Old Testament and New Testament, I don't think you're going to get to the heart of the gospel very quickly. And life is short. So it seems to me we ought to say something like this. Well, let's just begin with the New Testament, all right? And let's consider the New Testament in terms of historically reliable or unreliable documents. And we can provide pretty readily a good argument for the historical reliability of the New Testament documents, the gospel records, as you've indicated. And if that's the case, then, and if these documents contain eyewitness testimony to the leading character, namely Jesus, that is comparable to the kind of testimony that we would accept in any other historical situation, then of course we ought to go along with that. And if we do go along with it, what do we find Jesus saying about himself, and what do we find that his contemporaries are saying about him? Well, he is not presenting himself as a Jewish Boy Scout helping little old ladies across the Sea of Galilee. He is presenting himself as God Almighty, come to earth to die for the sins of the world. And he is he rises again from the dead, for goodness sake, which surely confirms the kind of claims that he made. So, if we then are able to conclude that Jesus is exactly the person he claimed to be, why not ask ourselves, what was his view of the Old Testament? And it's very easy to show that his view of the Old Testament is that it is God's word, it is revelatory. Now, if God thinks that the Old Testament is reliable, and there is a difference of opinion at Harvard, it seems to me we still ought to go along with God's opinion as to the reliability of the Old Testament. And he also, of course, proleptically put the forthcoming New Testament in that same category. How did he do this? Well, he gave the apostles authority, and the stuff included in the New Testament is apostolic, all right? And in the case of Paul, Paul was accepted by the original apostolic band as a legitimate apostle, and you find Peter saying there are people who misuse Paul's writings, misunderstand Paul's writings as they do the other scriptures. That means that Paul's writings are being accepted on the same level as the canonical Old Testament and so on. So we can get to the reliability of the Bible through Jesus. And the value of doing it that way is that this makes your apologetic as close to the proclamation of the gospel as possible. The trouble with so many apologetics is that even if they're correct, they are so far distant from the gospel that you've still got to get to the gospel in order to provide any testimony of how you get saved. The value of the approach I'm just setting forth is that your apologetic for the Bible starts with what happens in the case of Jesus in the New Testament. And it starts with examining historical documents in the very same way as you would examine any secular document. And therefore, if the non-Christian doesn't want to do that, then he should, of course, throw out his knowledge of secular history, shouldn't he? He should heave Napoleon out the window and Julius Caesar and I don't know how many other people, right?
All of them. It's the only way we have any history from that era. We got them all the same way. So totally agree with Dr. Montgomery, but I still struggle, still have a hard time with the God who. Help us with that.
Paul says in Romans 11:22, "Behold the kindness and severity of God." Miroslav Volf, a contemporary theologian, when there was warfare going on in his home country, Croatia, he said that he saw so much destruction, rape, and pillage, and people, his people shelled day in and day out. And he used to think that God, a God who was angry, was an inferior type of deity that one couldn't believe in. But he said, but after that experience, he said that he could not but believe in a God who was wrathful at sin. And he said that God is wrathful or angry, not in spite of his love, but because he is love. And so when you look at what's going on with regard to the Canaanites, you have people who are engaging in acts that are, in any civilized society would be considered criminal. Bestiality, incest, ritual prostitution, infant sacrifice. And when you have that kind of a corrupt culture, and also God waits over half a millennium before telling the Israelites to drive out the Canaanites. He waits till the sin of the Amorites are filled up. That you have a God who is angry at sin, and we see this reflected in the New Testament. Jesus takes that same view of the Old Testament scriptures. In fact, Jesus is seen as, we can connect this to Jesus too, that Jesus himself in Jude 5, it says, Jesus, this is the best manuscript say, Jesus, after he had delivered the Israelites from Egypt, destroyed those who did not believe. So you see that with Jesus there is wrathfulness, even destruction, as well as kindness and compassion. And so as we look at the Old Testament scriptures, we see that there is just judgment, patient waiting, that it is not ethnically driven, because there's nothing inherently problematic with the Canaanites. Rahab joins up, etc. But you also see a God, in the Old Testament, who is, when that language is being used, it reflects that kind of ancient Near Eastern culture, and Jim Hoffmeyer's done a lot of good work on this, where there is a lot of rhetorical language in war texts, where when it says, we utterly destroyed them, however that's to be translated, we left alive nothing that breathed, that these are exaggerations. You could have a lot of survivors, but if you've won a narrow victory, you could say we utterly destroyed them. And again, Egyptians, Assyrians, and so forth, they wrote in that same kind of language. We utterly destroyed them. We left alive nothing that breathed. And so the scriptures are utilizing that same sort of language. I'll give you a brief example, and I write about it in my forthcoming book, Is God a Vindictive Bully? It's a follow-up to my Moral Monster book. But in Numbers 21, you see, Sihon and Og, these two kings who are Moses wants to pass through this territory with the Israelites, and they say no, and they take up arms to fight against the Israelites. And it says, and it's interesting that the army is listed as the king, his sons, and this male army. And in fact, they traveled 20 miles from the Arnon to the Jabbok rivers, and they are so sturdy forces here. So it says we totally wiped them out, using that same sort of language. You get to Deuteronomy. It says in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, when they're fighting against them, it says there were man and woman, young and old. Well, in the original account, they weren't there, but this is part of the hyped up rhetoric that's picked up in Deuteronomy and then later on in other books like 1 Samuel 15. So there is that rhetoric, that hyperbole of exaggeration that is there. So what you see going on, and as Holly has mentioned, you need to take these biblical books according to the genre in which we find them and try to understand best how to interpret them according to how they would have been understood in their first setting of the ancient Near East. So what I've tried to do is to look at these issues, a lot of stuff that we can talk about, and you need an Empire State Building kind of elevator to have this kind of a conversation.
I think we have
initially,
one.
but those are a few things that you may find helpful, and I've got some stuff on the internet that might be helpful as well.
Good.
And I actually want to chime in to support what Paul was saying, because I think sometimes people can think, maybe your elevator interlocutor would say this, I think they can feel like there's a bit of special pleading of when we say there's hyperbole or this rhetorical language in the Bible. So I would say, no, this is just the use of literary language. I mean, consider the Black Friday sales. If you look at the advertisements, they're going to say things like greatest sale of all time, 10% discounts, conditions apply. So there's this use of rhetorical language. And of course, when we see greatest sale of the year, we're not going to read that as literally there has been no higher discount in the last 364 days. We're going to say, there's a good sale going on. And of course, they're trying to get us interested. And maybe they're trying to say it's a better sale than the average. We take this so for granted that it's invisible to us. And the kind of language of overstatement. Like, for instance, I could say, and I was kind of complaining to one of my friends yesterday, I was traveling all day yesterday. Well, literally I wasn't, because my flight was at 1:35 p.m. and I got into my hotel at about 9 o'clock. But it sure felt like it was all day. And of course, that was what was communicated. And so we do use this language all the time. We're just not necessarily aware of it. Again, literary education, please folks, the humanities matter. It really does. And so I think when we talk about this use of hyperbole in the Bible, we need to understand that it's not special pleading. So for instance, we see this even in the New Testament. Jesus says, if your right hand offends you, cut it off. He's not saying, please mutilate yourself. He's saying, be aware of occasions of sin and take radical self-denying action, even if it is really unpleasant, rather than fall into sin. It's about the seriousness of sin. It's not an advocate of self-mutilation. And I think the key point here is that this does not make what he's saying somehow less true. It's a literary device to present truth. And so that's why I take great issue with people saying things like it's just a metaphor. There's no just about metaphor. And we also would need to distinguish between what's a metaphor and what's not. This could be an entire Empire State Building for me, but I will just say, if someone says, oh, well, that's just a metaphor, well, first of all, there's the issue with the just, but whenever there's a metaphor, one thing is standing for another thing. So you can't make a metaphor just to kind of wave away. So when Paul talks about a race, the Christian life is like a race, that's a metaphor, because the idea of a race is standing for the Christian life. But when Jesus says, I am the way, that's not a metaphor. He is making a statement using a vivid image, like a road or a path, but it's not a metaphor, because there's nothing you can swap out for it that would make it equally potent. Anything would water it down. So we need to also distinguish between metaphor and image. That gets us a little bit off of the track, but I do want to just back up that the importance of talking about language in the Bible, and maybe we could just briefly say, to our interlocutor in the elevator, oh yeah, there's some elevated language used to talk about, these Old Testament events, and we use that kind of language ourselves, don't we?
Yeah, right, yeah. Like in sports, we totally annihilated those guys. It's a modern day version of trash talk, like the ancient Near East had its own version of trash talk.
I'm going to steal that.
Well, I kid you not. I want you to see the clock. We have literally 1 minute, but I have to get this out, or we'll have staff members looking for me later. Dr. Menuge, science or faith, or science and faith?
Science and faith, the foundations of the scientific vocation are that we have an orderly world, our reason can figure out that order, our reason is attuned to that order. So it's based on the rationality of God and our being made in the image of God. When we look at the foundations of science, that was the understanding of the founders of the scientific revolution. Kepler and Galileo both used the idea that the world could be compared to a book, written not in any ordinary human language, but written in the language, they said, of mathematics. And so the very idea that there are universal laws of nature that we can figure out draws very heavily on theological assumptions. And this is the opinion of most secular historians of science, not just Christians. They all agree that's really how modern science began. And in fact, you think about the foundation of life. What is it? It's a language. It contains information. That's very unlikely, a very difficult fact to reconcile with the idea that there is just stuff, and from stuff we get vast amounts of information. It fits very well with the idea that in the beginning was the Word. It fits very well with a theistic universe where everything holds together in the Word.
So it's really a false choice. Science or is an unreasonable choice. Science and biblically informed, guided by the Holy Spirit, can be great partners, in fact. I'm grateful for these, and I'm certainly grateful for you. And if I could just take a quick moment of privilege for the moderator. What I'd mentioned earlier from William Lane Craig was a quote where he referenced the ultimate apologetic, which he says is your life. Your life. And recently, sadly, we've had some super strong personalities in the area of apologetics who have made mistakes, tragically fallen in their particular works of influence. So given that we are driven to personality so much so in our society, shouldn't we agree that we just need a whole lot more good apologists than a few great ones? And that means all of us have to become better in the field of apologetics, to understand for ourselves, to strengthen and defend our own faith, to help other Christians defend theirs, to challenge those who have yet to come to faith in Christ, to be good apologists, to be effective at using Scripture, understanding truth, dealing with philosophies and some of these other areas. But it just comes down to all of us to live the apologetics that we share with others. And that's the ultimate apologetic. I think y'all are nodding, so I'm assuming you're in agreement that first priority is to be living proof as we give proofs for the sake of the gospel. Dr. Montgomery, do you have a thought on that before we pray and close? I see you
well,
do.
I happen to disagree fundamentally with the notion that the ultimate apologetic is your life. I think this is terrible mistake to think this. Why? Well, do we remember Ravi Zacharias? Huh? The fact of the matter is that no matter how sweet and spiritual you are, you happen to be a sinner, and there are corners of your life that aren't what they should be. All right? This is true of every one of us. And if you refocus the apologetic on the apologist, you're making a dreadful mistake, because they're going to find out sometime exactly who you really are. And that's going to hurt the faith immensely. Years ago, I was on the phone with Henry Morris, the creationist. And Henry said, Montgomery, the ultimate apologetic for our time is the refutation of evolution. And I said, get off it, Henry. The ultimate apologetic has always been the same. It is the proclamation and defense of Jesus Christ. The ultimate apologetic is Christocentric. It is not anthropocentric. It must never focus on the relationships or the sanctification or anything like that of the apologist. Because if we do this, we're putting our eggs in the wrong basket. The ultimate apologetic from the beginning of the church right up to the final judgment is the clear, straightforward proclamation of Jesus Christ, and where that is questioned, the defense of it. So, you will pardon that. I really didn't want to ruin your conclusion.
Well,
There you are. I would say something. And just to be clear, I actually agree with you 100%. I think the point that Dr. Craig is making, and that I want to reinforce, is that what we don't want to do is give a strong verbal witness that's contradicted by the actual witness of our life. And I think you and I would agree on that. I don't want to become the stumbling block to the gospel, or the reason primarily that a person is turned away from the gospel.
I'm not suggesting that we should sin that grace may the more abound or anything like that.
Good.
We
are in agreement
I'm not
there.
saying that we should, live miserable lives and it won't make any difference in our proclamation. Obviously not. I am saying that our apologetic needs to be Christ-centered and not centered on our own effectiveness spiritually or in any other way, morally, spiritually, or whatever.
I think we're in 100% agreement on that.
You have to agree with this. You can't disagree with it.
You're in the right place, Doctor. You're in the right place.
Well, I do want to jump in and make a point. I agree with you, but I also agree with you.
Thank you.
And this is not relativism, because you're both seeing slightly different things. I agree with you. We want to be focused on Christ, but Christ says, that we need to be perfect, as our Father is perfect. We're called to this life of holiness. So I think the point is that we need to be trying to be Christ in the world. We can never live up to that, but we want people, when they look at us, to be seeing Christ in us, and therefore wanting to see Christ himself. That, I think, is the point of the life of holiness.
The trouble with this is that the Mormons are often a lot more spiritual and pleasant and kind and relational than we are, and there are pagans. There are at university. Some of my philosophy professors were saintly. They were the Mother Teresas of philosophy. All right, but
well, good, then we
unfortunately, they were dead wrong. They were dead wrong in the worldview that they were espousing. Okay?
Well, I'm going to close this in
and
prayer now that I've gotten this down. Here's the thing. No one will suggest living a certain lifestyle absent the gospel or the truth of the gospel. Clearly, I think the point Dr. Craig is making, and that may be where Paul's going to come along, is to simply say, let's don't be the problem. Let's be a part of the solution. But Jesus is the gospel. The gospel is the message, of course. And if you want to use the word ultimate apologetic in that sense, then most certainly Jesus is preach Jesus. I've heard it said, Jesus doesn't need to be defended, it needs to be proclaimed. And that being the end of it. But we're apologists, so we do need to defend. That's also scriptural. And one of the ways we do that is by the life we live and the love that we share. And I know your personality and your approach to this is loving and caring and compassionate about the person, because it's their soul we're talking about here.
Yeah, it
not an
seems to
argument.
me. It seems to me that that should go without saying. You know, it really, because today there is so much of a tendency to move things from a Christ-centered approach to a man-centered, human-centered approach. And I see that as a real danger.
Yeah,
I
agreed.
don't want to have the quality of the apologetic refocused on the sanctity of the apologist and his life, because I'm
think we're in-
sure, I mean, Ravi Zacharias is not the last one they're going to catch. They're going to catch some
You
of
are
them.
sadly correct on that. I think we're all in agreement. Last word, Dr. Menuge, and we're going
Well,
to
I
close.
think that C.S. Lewis got it right with part of being authentic is being honest about our own sinful weaknesses. And
Yes.
he wrote in a letter to Sheldon Van Auken, think of me as a fellow patient in the same hospital who, because he was admitted earlier, could give some advice. And in saying that, he was pointing the unbeliever to the same physician as the physician of his soul. So if he had any advantage, his advantage ultimately was Christ. And I think that, go back to Augustine's Confessions, I think that the honesty about our fallibility is actually an important part of our apologetic as well.
Excellent word. This has been fun. Would you help me say thanks to our panel? Well done.